Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris for this acrylic painting tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you how easy it is to paint this amazing bird from one of my latest designs, Spring Bluebird. So whether you are a beginner or painting for fun, this is simple, easy, and impressive. So grab your brushes and let's get started. This is the finished project, and everything I used will be listed below if you're interested in the complete pattern. But I wanted to share with you today just the Bluebird, and I'm using DecoArt Americana paints. I have my number 5 Radical Round, and currently I'm using Raw Sienna, just using the toe of my brush to stroke on different brush strokes in the direction of the feathers. So it will create that look of a rounded head just by the way that the brush strokes are applied. Using Raw Sienna, switch to Payne's Gray. And Payne's Gray looks fabulous with Raw Sienna. It just turns into a deep, rich brown color. So they're blended together just absolutely beautifully. And that's what I will be using throughout for the shading color and for the darkest, deepest colors. The beak is Raw Sienna on the top. And again, just pulling that in. The bird is created using layers of color. It's not painted any one solid color. Painting the eye in Payne's Gray. Just going to build the colors up. It's so much easier when you're working with little bits of paint as opposed to painting the whole thing solid. And you have all these colors kind of glowing through. I'm building up the darkest colors first. And even though this is a bluebird, if I put this brownish Raw Sienna base coat underneath, it just is a beautiful base to build the feathers on. And again, they don't have to be so dark and heavy. That color just creates subtle shadows and builds the contour of the bird. Still using Raw Sienna, but I can create the shape of the entire bird strictly by the way I brush on my strokes. So I'm just giving indications of not doing any real solid, perfect outline. It's basically a soft outline, and it's not going to be messy, but it doesn't have to be harsh either. And I'm just laying in that little bit of Raw Sienna. I did pick up a lighter color to bring in some brightness, and that is the Natural Buff. It just has a hint of peach to it, and that's perfect as an undertone for the chest area, which will be a little bit lighter. Again, I'm blending it up into his face, and you can see he looks pretty good. He's going to be blue, but he looks pretty good as a brown bird. Letting the layers dry in between applications, because if you have wet paint and you start stroking on more wet paint, you're just going to lift that underneath layer right up. Now I know his top of his head, the top of his wings are all going to be a little bit brighter because that's where the light source is coming from. So I'm using that Natural Buff to just bring those highlights in. Brightening up his chest area as well. And once we get the basic highlights and lowlights of the bird in there, just by, I don't want to say blocking it in because we don't have solid blocked areas, as each stroke is kind of blended out a little bit. But there's definite highlights and lowlights. And you can tell where the light source is hitting. It's going to be on the strongest part. little bit of paint makes such a big difference. And I like to stress that over and over. It's not going to take much just to create that color. Adding a little bit of that natural buff to create the contour of that beak, and put a hint of yellow ochre in there. It's going to turn it a little bit golden. So I'm basically just using raw sienna. We touched a little bit of Payne's Gray and around the beak and underneath his head. And now I'm going back with a little bit of that Payne's Gray mixed with raw sienna. It's a beautiful gray brown. Absolutely gorgeous. But it's going to start bringing those blue tones in. You can just see a hint of blue with that mix. A very soft. And it's almost like magic the way this little bird starts to evolve. It goes from a little brown bird and you start bringing those colors in. This is sapphire, and I'm not cleaning my brush each time. So I have a little bit of, it's a dirty brush. So I have a little bit of color on it. I'm pulling it in as I'm stroking it out, picking up a little more color. Very, very thin, and I'm using fast drying glaze medium to thin my paint so it's not heavy. It's very loose, very translucent, and it's just giving me that hint of beautiful color. And this is sapphire blue that's just been thinned down with the glaze medium. Picking up a little bit of that Payne's Gray, just kind of pulling in some dark colors, just a hint. Payne's Gray is such a powerful color, and you don't need much to really make a big impact. It's just little touches of color to bring in a powerful, powerful effect. Just basically using, this is a whispering turquoise to brighten that up. Finger works great to blend it out. And again, stroking like you would for the direction that the feathers would grow. When the paint is wet, it's always a lot brighter. It's going to dry darker. So you can see his head will tone down. It looks really bright. But once we bring that sapphire in, do a few little washes and blend it together, look how it tones it down. And you can see how he's starting to turn blue, but he still has those golden undertones, which are absolutely beautiful. Just kind of going from whispering turquoise to sapphire, picking up some Payne's Gray for those darker areas. Just a hint of color. It's all about moderation and no heavy paint. Not once do I have a solid load of heavy paint on my brush. Pulling in some of those highlights. Not really concerned about perfect shapes right now. The wing is just there, but it's not completely defined yet. Just building color, building the structure, adding that look of feathers. And with each layer that is added, it just becomes a little more intricate and a little more impressive. A little bit of raw sienna. If it becomes too blue, a little bit of raw sienna will tone that down beautifully. This is a little bit of coral color just to kind of bring a hint of color into the chest area. This is coral shell. And it's a very soft color. Again, I have it very, very thin so that it's not going to be highly pigmented. Bringing in that Payne's Gray for those darker areas. Little strokes. And I don't finish one area completely. I add highlights on the entire bird. when I'm adding highlights. I don't just do his head and then go do his wing. I think that adds more continuity because the light source is covering the whole bird, not just one area. And I think if you do it at the same time, you get more continuity on that. A little bit of brightness on his chest area. If it's too much, I can tone it down, but it's always best to do little bits of color, to add them slowly and to look at it as it's building, to create volume and to create depth and to add those highlights in. And it always looks like the highlights are super bright until they dry. And then you start adding darker tones in, and that makes the highlights not so intense. And then you can go back and add more highlights. They have to balance out the darkness of the deepest parts. Make sure to have that little cheek area. It really makes the eye set in his face nice. Instead of looking like it's glued on, it'll be sunk down in. A little more of the coral color. I'm going to put a little bit of wild berry in there just to pink it up, just a hint. It doesn't need to be really strong colors. It still needs to be very muted. More highlights. The only thing you need to be careful that the brush strokes don't become fluffy like fur instead of feathers. Keep in mind the length of the feathers. The feathers on the head are little tiny short feathers. The feathers on the wing and the tail are going to be longer. Your finger is a great smudging tool. You can just blend those paints very easily. More highlights. Look how rounded his little head is becoming. And even though the chest area is on the shaded side, it's a lot lighter and it will have highlights on it as well. And these are more dry brushed highlights. They're not solid, heavy floats. Just gives that hint that there's more going on than a perfect smooth surface. It's just a wonderful way to build up all of those colors. Now I'm going to focus on the eye and bring a little more darkness in, back in there with Payne's Gray. I did bump down to a number 2 Radical Round for more control. Need to get that eye really dark so it looks like there's a lot of sparkle when I add just that little hint of white in there. This is Whispering Turquoise. And then I'm going to just put that little bit of float in there. It's going to make the eye look very glassy and a little bit of a sparkle. Brighten up a little bit on that beak as well. Have to be careful with the eye. Everybody will look right at the eye, so you want to make sure that you spend enough time in there, adding some more darkness in there so it doesn't look too washed out. But the eye needs to have a lot of depth to it, a lot of sparkle, a lot of like a glassy area, which is the float. And then that deep darkness. Make sure around the eye that it's nice and shaded so it looks like the eyelid comes around. Just adding a little bit more color around the eye to float that in. Back to the wings. Enhancing those highlights, not everywhere, just a few places, and that's all it needs. If you put them everywhere, you'll lose that impact that there's a strong light hitting there. It's kind of funny. One area is highlighted and then it needs other areas need to be brightened up as well. So when you're adding the highlights in, look at all the areas that need to be highlighted, not just the one area you're working on, because the light will splash the same on the back and the head and the wings and the beak. That's where they're going to hit. So they need to all be of equal value. Brighten up the chest a little bit. Just a little touch of paint makes such a big difference. Keep that in mind. Just a little bit. Adding some darker values, and I'm just taking some Payne's Gray and mixing it with a little bit of Raw Sienna. It gives you a nice deep dark gray blue. The Sapphire with Raw Sienna is a beautiful dark shading color, but the darkest parts need to be that with Payne's Gray. That's just really going to pull those strong colors in. It's such a powerful color. I thought the tail needed to be bright, but the tails are not bright. It's pointed down. There's going to be a lot of foliage around it, so I toned it down quite a bit. The wing is not quite the right shape, so this is where I'm using the toe of my brush, just a little bit of paint to start blending the wing in where it's connected. It's not just, right now it looks like it's stuck on there, but I'm going to blend it in. The shoulder will be separated, but right there at the joint, it needs to be softly blended. Just taking a little bit and smoothing it in, little touches. And I think in real time, I painted this bird in about 20 minutes, so doesn't take long to paint. Add some more highlights in there. Make sure that's nice and defined. Just a bit on the tail, not much. Now it looks pretty good, but it needs to have some shading in it, and this is going to create all that contrast. This is Payne's Gray, bringing in some strong shadows around the nest where it'll be shadowed, or where there's a shadow from where he's sitting, and pulling some shading on the nest. I hope you learned some new tips, tricks, and techniques. This was so much fun to paint, and I hope you give it a try. Everything I used is listed below. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. I would love to hear from you. Be sure to check out my other videos. If you like what you see, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so you won't miss out on upcoming videos. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next adventure together.